The time I realized something was off was when two men in matching Navy uniforms marched up my driveway like they owned the place. They had laminated badges swinging from cheap lanyards, clipboards clutched tight, and the smug posture of guys who watched too many cop shows. One of them shouted in a voice so rehearsed it almost cracked, "Sir, you are in violation of HOA Code 42-C." I had lived on this street for 3 years, and I knew one thing for certain: there was no HOA. Not one. And even if there had been, Code 42-C sounded more like the name of a Star Wars droid than a municipal regulation. I didn't panic. I leaned against the hood of my truck and took a slow sip of coffee, watching their faces twitch when I didn't immediately comply. That's the thing about people who pretend to have power. They hate dead air. They need you to jump. The shorter one, sweating through his cheap polyester shirt, pointed to my mailbox like it had just confessed to a crime. "This unit does not comply with neighborhood aesthetic. It must be removed." The taller one nodded gravely as if we were discussing nuclear arms. I turned and glanced at my mailbox. It was a plain steel box on a cedar post. Nothing flashy, nothing offensive. The only thing remotely unusual about it was the faint scorch mark from when my neighbor's teenage son thought Roman candles counted as firework. I couldn't help laughing. That was mistake number 1 in their eyes. The tall one puffed his chest. "Sir, failure to comply will result in fines and possible seizure of property." His voice shook at the word seizure. Even he didn't believe it. That's when she appeared. Karen. Blonde hair sculpted like a helmet, sunglasses big enough to serve as dinner plates, clipboard hugged to her chest like the Bible itself. She strutted up behind them, heels clicking against the pavement, wearing the expression of someone who expected a standing ovation for just existing. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. Everyone on this block knew Karen. She was the self-appointed neighborhood crusader who treated minor inconveniences like crimes against humanity. The fake officers stiffened when she arrived, like soldiers in front of their general. "This property," she declared, pointing her pen at me as if it were a sword, "has been in violation since the day you moved in. Unapproved landscaping, unauthorized fencing, questionable paint colors. And now this." She gestured again at my mailbox as if it were dripping with sin. I swallowed another sip of coffee and said, "Karen, I'll make you a deal. When you get a real badge, I'll get a new mailbox." The shorter officer looked like he might faint. Karen's lips pursed so tight they practically disappeared. And that's when she dropped the line that told me this was going to be bigger than a Saturday morning prank. "You think this is a joke? You'll be hearing from our station." She said it like she was talking about the Pentagon. Now, here's where it got absurd. Later that day, curious, I drove past the strip of land between our neighborhood and the wood. It was technically mine, part of the oddly drawn lot lines that had given me a couple acres more than I needed. And sitting there, squatting like a child's idea of an important building, was a prefab shed with the words, HOA Enforcement Station spray-painted across the side in stenciled letters. A lawn chair sat out front. A flagpole leaned sideways with a faded American flag clinging for dear life. I nearly drove off the road laughing. They had actually built a fake police station on my property. I pulled over, snapped a few photos with my phone, and considered my options. I could call the sheriff right away. Trespassing, fraud, impersonating officers. The list of charges would write itself. But something in me wanted to let this breathe. Karen thrived on control. The fake cops thrived on her validation. If I pushed back too soon, they'd just relocate. No, I wanted to see just how far they'd take it. So I waited. 4 days, the station bustled with activity. Cars I didn't recognize came and went. Men in those same Navy uniforms strutted around, handing each other clipboards, practicing their stern faces in the reflection of their car windows. At one point, I watched them actually write fake tickets and shove them under the wipers of cars parked on the street. They even tried to wave down a UPS truck like they were directing traffic. The driver laughed so hard he almost tipped over a stack of Amazon boxes. But then it stopped being funny. A neighbor, Eleanor, 75 years old and sharp as a tack, called me in tears one evening. 2 of the fake officers had knocked on her door, demanding back dues for an HOA that didn't exist. They threatened to put a lien on her house. She didn't fall for it, but she was rattled. That's when I knew this wasn't just theater. This was intimidation, fraud, and maybe worse. Karen was building herself a little empire, brick by fake brick, and using my land to stage it. I decided to fight. Not loudly, not with yelling matches in the street. That's Karen's game. No, I'd play the long one. Documentation, patience, timing. The next day, I walked down to the station with a tape measure, a camera, and a bright orange survey flag. The fake officers froze when they saw me approaching. Karen herself sat in the lawn chair like a queen on a throne, sipping iced tea through a straw. I planted the survey flag directly in front of the shed door. "Just marking my property line," I said casually. "Wouldn't want you folks to be confused." Karen's face drained of color. She knew exactly what I was implying. "This is community land," she snapped. "It belongs to all of us." I shook my head. Funny thing about county records. They don't lie. Then I turned and walked away, leaving her to stew. That night, through my window, I saw lights inside the shed flicker on. They were working late, probably drafting more fake codes to enforce. And as absurd as it was, I felt the first twinge of real anger. They had crossed from ridiculous to dangerous. They had started to scare people. And if there's one thing I can't stomach, it's bullies who hide behind costumes. I promised myself I'd take them down. But not by shouting. Not by fighting on their terms. I'd use patience, wit, and the one thing they underestimated most: the truth. And that's when the real war with Karen and her fake cops began. The next morning, I woke to find an envelope taped to my front door. No postage, no return address, just a piece of paper folded in thirds with a crooked official-looking stamp printed across the top. HOA Enforcement Authority, violation notice, it read, followed by a laundry list of supposed offenses: failure to maintain uniform lawn height, non-compliant mailbox design, unauthorized vehicle in driveway, and attitude unbecoming of a resident. That last one almost made me spit out my coffee. They had literally cited me for my attitude. I laughed so hard I had to lean against the wall. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized Karen was escalating. She wasn't satisfied with her station as a roadside joke. She wanted legitimacy, and she was trying to create it out of thin air. I walked across the street to Eleanor's house to check on her. She opened the door clutching a similar envelope. Her hands trembled as she handed it over. Inside, the violation accused her of unauthorized holiday decorations. The kicker? It was August. The only decoration on her porch was a potted fern. "They can't do this, right?" she asked, eyes wide with fear. I assured her they couldn't, but I also realized the damage had already been done. Karen didn't need the law on her side. She just needed people to believe she had it. Fear was her currency, and some of the neighbors were already spending it. By that evening, I spotted a small crowd gathered near the fake station. Karen stood in front of the shed, clipboard raised like a prophet's tablet, explaining her codes to a few curious neighbors. The fake officers flanked her, arms crossed, sunglasses on even though the sun had dipped behind the trees. She was building followers. That worried me more than the ticket, because once people start believing in something, even nonsense, it gains momentum. A myth can move mountains if enough people are willing to push. I needed evidence, so I started collecting. I snapped photos of the shed, the fake badges, the tickets, everything. I even recorded a short video of Karen reading her codes aloud. The camera picked up her nasal voice listing penalties like a schoolteacher scolding children. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and potential seizure of assets, she declared, mispronouncing assets so badly it sounded like asses. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. 2 days later, I came home to find my truck gone. At first, I thought it had been stolen. Panic shot through me until I spotted it parked crookedly in front of the shed, orange paper slapped under the wiper blade. They had towed it, well, pushed it, more like, from my driveway to their station as an impound. The ticket read, "Violation of unauthorized vehicle storage." I stood there in the road staring at my own truck like I was looking at a dead body. That's when anger finally replaced humor. They had touched my property. They had crossed into my life in a way I couldn't laugh off. Neighbors gathered around, whispering. Some laughed at the absurdity, others shook their heads in disbelief, but Karen stood tall, arms folded, like a sheriff overseeing an arrest. "This vehicle is non-compliant," she declared loudly, ensuring everyone heard. "It will remain impounded until fines are paid." She looked at me, daring me to react. Instead, I smiled. A calm, deliberate smile that I knew would irritate her more than shouting ever could. "Thanks for the free parking," I said, and walked inside without another word. That's when I realized my greatest weapon was restraint. Karen thrived on confrontation. Deny her that, and she unraveled. That night, I made calls. First to the county records office. I had the land survey emailed to me, complete with highlighted parcel boundaries. The shed sat squarely within my property lines. That was my nuclear bomb. But I didn't want to drop it just yet. Then I called the sheriff's department. I explained the situation, careful not to exaggerate. The deputy on the line chuckled when I mentioned the station. He promised to send someone out, but warned me they were backed up. "Keep documenting everything," he said. "Don't engage unless you have to." That was fine by me. Patience, remember? The next morning, Karen upped her game. She and her fake cops delivered flyers to every mailbox in the neighborhood. HOA community guidelines. The header read, followed by 10 absurd rules. No lawn chairs visible from the street. No vehicles over 10 years old in driveways. No pets larger than 20 pounds. No fences taller than 4 feet. And my favorite, all exterior paint colors must be pre-approved by the HOA Enforcement Authority. At the bottom was a fine schedule that climbed from $50 to $5,000. $5,000! She was insane or brilliant, depending how you looked at it. By creating the illusion of authority, she was fishing for suckers willing to pay to avoid trouble. And in every neighborhood, there are always a few who would rather write a check than deal with conflict. I decided to bait her. That afternoon, I mowed my lawn in deliberate diagonal stripes, making it look like a baseball field. I parked my truck sideways in my driveway, tailgate down, music playing. And for good measure, I painted my mailbox bright neon green. Within an hour, the fake officers marched up with clipboards. Karen followed, camera phone in hand, narrating loudly about violations and infractions. They wrote me a ticket so long it looked like a CVS receipt. I took it from their hands, smiled, and shredded it into confetti right in front of them. The crowd of neighbors watching gasped. Karen's face turned crimson. She hissed like a teakettle about escalated penalties and legal repercussions, but I simply went inside, leaving the confetti fluttering across my lawn. That night, my phone buzzed with texts from neighbors. Some called me reckless, others called me brave. A few even confessed they'd been scared into paying Karen already. One family shelled out $200 for fence approval. Another paid $50 to keep their old minivan parked. I was furious, but it also gave me leverage. Fraud over a few fake tickets is one thing. Collecting money under false pretenses? That's criminal. I compiled screenshots, receipts, and witness statements. I was building a case, brick by brick, the same way Karen was building her empire. Only mine had actual law on its side. The breaking point came when Karen held a hearing in front of the shed. She set up folding chairs, a podium, even a little gavel she must have ordered online. The fake cops stood guard while she lectured about order, discipline, and community pride. Then she called out my name, demanding I come forward to face judgment. I didn't move. I watched from my porch with binoculars, sipping a beer like it was primetime TV. The crowd shifted uncomfortably when I didn't appear. Karen banged her toy gavel, shouting about contempt, but it was clear the facade was cracking. People were starting to see through the act. Not everyone, but enough. The sheriff's cruiser rolled up at 9 sharp the next morning, a flash of authority in a neighborhood that had grown used to counterfeit versions. I was standing on my porch with a folder full of documents, waiting like a man about to argue a parking ticket. Karen and her fake cops scrambled out of the shed the moment the real deal pulled in, their clipboards clutched like shield. She straightened her blazer, smoothed her hair, and walked toward the cruiser as if she were welcoming a colleague. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so pathetic. Deputy Collins, a barrel-chested man with a permanent squint, stepped out and immediately raised an eyebrow at the sight of the spray-painted shed. "Morning," he said, voice flat. "Somebody want to explain to me why my dispatcher said there's a police station on Maplewood Drive I've never heard of?" Karen pounced. "Deputy, thank goodness you're here. We've been running this community enforcement office to protect the neighborhood from violators." She jabbed her finger toward me. "This man has been our biggest problem. Refuses to comply. Openly defiant." I stepped forward calmly, folder under my arm. "Morning, Deputy. Before we get lost in fiction, I'd like to provide you with county land records showing that shed sits entirely on my property. No lease, no easement, no permission." I handed him the highlighted survey map. Collins studied it, then looked up at the shed. His expression didn't change, but I caught the faint twitch of amusement in the corner of his mouth. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "you realize impersonating law enforcement is a felony?" Karen bristled. "We are not impersonating police. We are the HOA Enforcement Authority. Entirely different." Collins pointed to the cheap badges dangling from the men's lanyards. "Those look an awful lot like police credentials. And this," he gestured toward the words, HOA Enforcement Station, spray-painted on the shed, "sure looks like you're trying to pass yourself off as something official." The taller fake cop stammered, "We were just helping keep order." Collins cut him off. "By towing trucks off private property? By issuing fines? That's fraud, son." The shorter one swallowed hard, eyes darting toward Karen for reassurance. But she stood her ground. "Deputy, if you allow this man," she jabbed at me again, "to flout rules, the entire neighborhood will collapse into chaos. Someone has to maintain standards." I couldn't resist. "Chaos? Karen, the biggest crime in this neighborhood is your color-coordinated flower pots." A few neighbors who'd gathered to watch snorted with laughter. Collins looked between us, then sighed. "Here's what's going to happen. This shed is coming down. Today. It's trespassing and it's a nuisance." He turned to the fake officers. "Hand me those badges." They hesitated until Karen hissed, "Do it." Collins collected the lanyards, tossed them in his cruiser, and told the men to go home. They scattered like kids caught shoplifting. Karen stayed, arms crossed, glaring daggers at me. But she wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. By that afternoon, the shed was still standing. Collins had filed his report, but he didn't have authority to demolish it without a court order. Karen knew this, and she leaned on the technicality. She marched around telling neighbors that the sheriff had recognized her station, conveniently leaving out the felony impersonation part. And unbelievably, a few people bought it. The illusion still had legs. That's when I realized this battle wasn't about law anymore. It was about perception. The next twist came 2 nights later. I woke at midnight to a strange buzzing sound outside. At first, I thought it was cicadas, but when I stepped onto my porch, I saw it. A drone hovering above my yard, red lights blinking. It dipped low, circled the truck in my driveway, then zipped back toward the shed. I nearly laughed at the audacity. Karen had graduated to aerial surveillance. The next morning, a new violation notice appeared on my door citing unauthorized vehicle angle and non-compliant lawn striping. They were using drone footage to police my grass. It was absurd and brilliant in a way. She was doubling down with technology. I countered by installing a motion-activated floodlight and my own trail camera. That evening, the drone returned. This time, my light snapped on and the camera caught a crystal-clear image of the operator. Karen herself, standing in the dark with a controller in her hands, face illuminated like a raccoon in a trash can. The photo was gold. I printed copies and tucked them into my growing evidence folder. Still, Karen wasn't just targeting me anymore. Eleanor called again, saying she'd been cited for unauthorized curtain patterns. A family down the block was warned about their kids' bicycles being unregistered. One neighbor, tired of the harassment, actually paid a $300 annual assessment fee to avoid trouble. That's when my calm patience hardened into resolve. This wasn't neighborhood theater anymore. She was conning people out of real money. I spent the next few days quietly rallying support. I showed neighbors the drone photo. I shared screenshots of texts from people admitting they'd paid. I reminded them that the sheriff had already confiscated the badges. Slowly, the tide began to turn. People who'd once whispered about Karen's authority started whispering about her lies instead. But Karen, sensing her grip loosening, staged her boldest stunt yet. On Saturday morning, I stepped outside to find a banner strung across the entrance of our street. HOA Enforcement Authority, residents only. 2 of the fake cops were back, wearing matching polos this time instead of uniforms, stopping cars and waving through only approved vehicles. I walked up, phone recording, and asked what they thought they were doing. Security checkpoint, the tall one said, avoiding my eyes. For the safety of the neighborhood. Karen emerged from a lawn chair nearby, sipping coffee like it was a summer festival. Non-compliant vehicles will be redirected, she announced. We can't have standards slipping. That was my cue. I stepped into the middle of the street and held up the survey map. This land? This road? County jurisdiction. Not HOA. And certainly not yours. Then I turned my phone screen so the crowd could see the photo of Karen flying her drone. Gasps rippled through the group. Karen's face flushed crimson. She snatched the controller from her bag and waved it defiantly. I was gathering evidence, she screeched. But the damage was done. Neighbors laughed, some booed. The fake cops backed away, clearly embarrassed. I didn't push further right then. I let the humiliation hang in the air, let her stew in it. Because I knew something she didn't. On Monday morning, I had a meeting scheduled with the County Code Enforcement Office. Armed with evidence of trespassing, fraud, and aerial surveillance, I planned to deliver the knockout blow. That night, as I sat on my porch sipping a beer, I spotted Karen pacing in front of the shed, phone pressed to her ear, voice shrill even from a distance. She was plotting her next move. I knew she wouldn't go quietly. People like Karen never do. They double down until the walls cave in. And I was more than ready to bring the walls down. Monday morning arrived with the weight of anticipation pressing against my ribs. I had my evidence folder tucked under my arm, maps neatly highlighted, photos clipped in order, drone image on top like a trophy. Walking into the County Code Enforcement Office felt less like filing a complaint and more like preparing for a courtroom drama. The receptionist barely looked up until I slid the drone photo across the counter. Her eyebrows shot up. 10 minutes later, I was sitting with a county inspector named Hernandez, who studied the pile of papers with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. You're telling me she built an unauthorized enforcement shed, collected money from residents and flew surveillance drones? He asked. I nodded. On my property, I added. He let out a slow whistle. That's about as illegal as it gets without involving counterfeit money. Hernandez promised swift action. He scheduled an inspection for Wednesday, explaining he wanted to catch them in the act, not just after the fact. If they're collecting money, that's fraud. If they're operating on your land, that's trespassing. If they're impersonating authority, that's criminal impersonation. We can shut this down from 3 angles at once. It was music to my ears. I left the office feeling like I'd finally loaded the cannon. Now it was just a matter of aiming. But Karen must have sensed the shift in momentum, because by Tuesday evening she unleashed her most audacious stunt yet. I came home from work to find a bright orange sticker slapped across my front door. Property condemned, it read in block letters, complete with a bogus signature line that simply said, HOA Authority. My stomach dropped, then bubbled into laughter so strong I had to sit on the porch step. She had actually tried to condemn my house. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering. Some looked shocked, others amused, but Karen stood across the street with her arms crossed, chin raised as if she'd just executed the perfect chess move. That's when Eleanor shuffled over, eyes blazing with indignation. She tried to put one of those on my house too, she muttered, waving a crumpled sticker. I told her I'd rather die in my living room than move, because of her nonsense. I hugged Eleanor's shoulder and whispered, "Don't worry. Wednesday's her reckoning." But Karen wasn't done flexing. Later that night, I saw movement near my truck. When I peeked out, I found one of her fake officers, now reduced to plain clothes but still loyal, slapping a boot onto my front tire. A bright yellow wheel clamp, obviously ordered online, locked around the rim. My jaw tightened. It was petty. It was illegal. And it was proof she was unraveling. I took photos, smiled for the camera, then calmly went back inside. She wanted me to storm out, scream, maybe even rip the clamp off in front of an audience. I refused to give her the satisfaction. By Wednesday morning, Hernandez arrived with a county sheriff and 2 enforcement officers. The convoy of white trucks pulled onto the street, and suddenly the neighborhood had the energy of a small-town parade. Residents emerged from their homes, some clapping quietly, others watching nervously. Karen tried to intercept them at the shed, clipboard in hand, voice high-pitched and desperate. "You can't just march onto community property," she shrieked. Hernandez held up my survey map. "Ma'am, this land isn't community property. It's his. You're trespassing." The sheriff added, "And these complaints we've received. Money collected under false pretenses, threats of liens. Care to explain that?" Karen sputtered. "Those were voluntary donations. People wanted to support neighborhood order." But Eleanor, bless her sharp tongue, piped up from her porch. "Donations don't come with threats of foreclosure." That got a laugh from half the crowd. Hernandez circled the shed, snapping photos, while the sheriff asked Karen for permits. She had none. The fake cops who'd once strutted like roosters now stood pale and silent, avoiding eye contact. Hernandez finally declared, "This structure is unauthorized. It must be removed immediately." The sheriff added, "And I strongly advise you, ma'am, to stop impersonating law enforcement before we make this official." Karen's composure cracked. "You can't do this," she screamed, voice cracking. "This is harassment. This is persecution." But the sheriff was unmoved. He handed her a notice of violation and warned her that further action could result in fines, or jail. She stormed off toward her house, muttering about conspiracies, leaving her fake officers abandoned at the scene. For a brief moment I felt victorious. Neighbors clapped me on the back. Eleanor beamed. Hernandez promised to file his report within the week. It seemed like the war was finally over. But deep down I knew better. People like Karen don't retreat. They regroup. Sure enough, that night I spotted her porch light blazing well past midnight. Cars I didn't recognize came and went, headlights slicing across the street. She was plotting. I imagined her sitting at her dining table with stacks of papers, scribbling plans like a general preparing for battle. The condemned sticker, the wheel clamp, those weren't mistakes. They were the opening salvo of a counterattack. My confirmation came Thursday afternoon. A certified letter arrived in my mailbox, embossed with a faux seal that read, "Neighborhood Judicial Committee." Inside was a summons ordering me to appear before a community court on Saturday. The charges? Gross noncompliance, repeated defiance, and public ridicule of authority. I laughed so hard I nearly choked. She had invented a court. But when I looked closer, I realized this wasn't just another flyer. She'd roped in a few neighbors, those who'd either feared her or believed her, to sign their names as committee members. Suddenly, her theater had an audience again. I knew better than to ignore it. Not because it had teeth, but because perception mattered. If she staged her kangaroo court and I refused to show, she'd spin it as proof of my guilt. No, I had to attend. But not empty-handed. I'd bring every shred of evidence I'd collected, every photo, every map, every fake ticket. And I'd let her bury herself in her own lies. Friday evening, I walked the block, talking to neighbors one by one. Some were fed up, ready to testify about her intimidation. Others were hesitant, worried about retaliation. But more than a few promised to come watch. "This'll be better than cable," one neighbor joked. He wasn't wrong. That night, as I sat on my porch, Karen's house glowed with frantic energy. Through the curtains I could see her pacing, waving her arms, barking orders at the last two fake officers who still followed her. She thought Saturday would be her triumph. She thought her court would cement her authority. She had no idea she was walking straight into her own undoing. And I was going to enjoy every second of it. Saturday morning dawned hot and heavy, the kind of weather that makes tempers short and patience thinner. By 10 o'clock, folding chairs were arranged in neat rows on the street in front of the shed, which Karen had redecorated with streamers and a cheap vinyl banner that read Neighborhood Judicial Committee. At the center stood a card table draped in a white sheet, stacked with papers, a plastic gavel, and a microphone hooked to a speaker that screeched feedback every time she tapped it. It looked less like a court and more like a garage sale gone wrong. I arrived deliberately late, carrying my thick evidence folder in one hand and a travel mug of coffee in the other. I wanted her to stew, to let the suspense stretch like a rubber band. The crowd was bigger than I expected. Nearly half the neighborhood had shown up, some out of fear, some out of curiosity, and others because Saturday entertainment doesn't usually come this free. Karen stood behind the table in a navy suit that looked borrowed from a thrift store, her sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. Two of her most loyal fake officers flanked her, now wearing armbands that read security. The whole thing would have been comical if it weren't so menacing. As soon as she spotted me, she banged her plastic gavel. "The committee will come to order!" She shouted into the squealing mic. "Resident," she paused dramatically, "you stand accused of repeated defiance, harassment of authority, and endangering the harmony of this community. How do you plead?" I sipped my coffee, then set the mug down on her table, leaving a wet ring on the white sheet. "I plead not guilty," I said calmly. "And also amused." Laughter rippled through the crowd, though Karen shot them a glare sharp enough to slice steel. She began reading a list of charges from her clipboard, her voice rising with each line. Unauthorized mailbox. Unauthorized lawn patterns. Unauthorized vehicle angles. And most egregiously, she cried, mocking the authority of this committee with blatant disrespect. At that, I opened my folder and pulled out the drone photo. I held it up high so everyone could see. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice clear without a microphone, "the only authority here is Karen playing with a toy drone at midnight. This is your judge." Gasps and laughter erupted. Even some of her loyalists looked uneasy. Karen banged her gavel again, red-faced. "That was surveillance. Legal surveillance," she insisted. But I wasn't done. I laid out the fake tickets, the bogus violation notices, the condemned sticker, the photo of my truck booted. "These aren't rules," I said, my voice steady, "they're scams. And neighbors, many of you sitting here, have paid real money because you were threatened. That's fraud." Eleanor stood then, waving her crumpled violation envelope. "He's right. She tried to fine me for my curtains." Others chimed in, stories of bogus fees, intimidation, harassment. One neighbor admitted paying $300 for fence approval. A murmur of anger rolled through the crowd, louder this time, no longer hushed. Karen's face twisted into desperation. She pointed at me, her voice shrill. He's manipulating you. He's the problem. If we don't enforce standards, this neighborhood will collapse into slums. But her words fell flat now. The illusion of authority she had clung to was cracking. People weren't laughing with her anymore. They were laughing at her. Then came the breaking moment. Hernandez, the county inspector, stepped forward from the crowd. I hadn't expected him to attend, but there he was, badge visible on his belt. He raised his voice above the din. This entire setup is unlawful. This so-called committee has no authority. In fact, if it continues, charges will be filed. The crowd hushed. Karen sputtered, "You can't shut us down. We have rights." Hernandez shook his head. Not rights to impersonate courts, not rights to trespass, and not rights to scam your neighbors. The sheriff's deputy from earlier appeared beside him, folding his arms. "We'll be filing a report with the district attorney," he added. That was the hammer. Karen's eyes widened, her gavel slipping from her hand and clattering to the pavement. The two fake officers glanced at each other, then quietly slipped away through the crowd. The empire was collapsing. But Karen wasn't finished yet. She never is. With trembling hands, she snatched up her microphone and shouted, "This is tyranny. You're all sheep. He's lying to you. I will not be silenced." Her voice cracked into feedback, echoing down the street. Neighbors booed, some shouted back. A few chairs toppled as people stood and yelled. What had begun as theater turned into chaos. I stayed calm. I simply gathered my folder, turned to the crowd, and said, "You've seen the truth. Decide for yourselves who you trust." Then I walked away, leaving Karen screaming into her microphone, her voice drowned out by a chorus of jeers. Later that day, I found the shed door hanging open. The banner was torn down, the table overturned, papers scattered like confetti in the wind. It was over. Or so I thought. That night, just past midnight, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of my house taken in the dark, from just a few feet away. The caption read, "This isn't over." My stomach nodded. For the first time, a chill crept in where sarcasm usually lived. Karen wasn't just humiliated, she was dangerous now. The next morning, I tightened the locks, checked my cameras, and called the sheriff again. They promised patrols, promised to keep an eye out, but I knew Karen wasn't dumb enough to make her threats obvious. No, she'd come back in ways that were harder to prove, harder to trace. And as I watched the sun rise over the neighborhood, I realized the war had entered a new phase. The fake cops were gone. The shed was crumbling. But Karen herself? She was just getting started. The days that followed felt like living under a low, constant hum of tension. I'd wake each morning expecting to find another bogus ticket on my door, another sticker slapped across my windows, or worse, another photo slipped into my mailbox proving Karen had crept onto my property in the middle of the night. The shed had been abandoned, the spray-painted station, now a sad skeleton of plywood and flapping tarps, but that didn't mean Karen was done. If anything, the wreckage of her empire seemed to fuel her bitterness. On Wednesday, I got my first real taste of her new campaign. A truck from the city utilities department pulled into my driveway without warning. The driver, clipboard in hand, informed me they'd received an anonymous complaint that my property was illegally hooked into the water main. "That's a serious violation," he said, already kneeling to inspect the curb connection. My chest tightened. If Karen had actually managed to convince the city I was tampering with utilities, I could be facing fines, inspections, even criminal charges. But I stayed calm, pulled out my folder, now my constant companion, and showed him the pile of documents, inspection reports, and permit. After 10 minutes of digging, he stood, shaking his head. "This was a waste of my time," he muttered. "And yours. Whoever filed this complaint, it's bogus." He climbed back into his truck and drove off, but I didn't miss the look of frustration in his eyes. Karen wasn't just harassing neighbors anymore. She was trying to weaponize the city against me. That evening, I spotted her across the street, watering her flower beds with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She raised her glass of iced tea like a toast, as if to say, "Round one to me." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned back into the house, pulled up my security camera feeds, and added another entry to the log I'd been keeping of every incident. Documentation was my shield, and I was determined to keep it polished. Thursday brought a new twist. A man in a suit knocked on my door. He introduced himself as an attorney representing the Maplewood Homeowners Association, presenting a glossy packet of papers. According to him, I was being sued for damages to community harmony and slander against elected officials. I nearly laughed in his face until I flipped through the packet. It wasn't official, not really. It was a mess of boilerplate templates downloaded from the internet, with HOA scribbled into the blanks. But the lawyer himself was real, albeit sheepish. "Look," he admitted, "I'm being paid to file this, but off the record, this isn't going anywhere. Just thought you should know she's serious." I thanked him, tucked the papers into my folder, and wondered how deep Karen's pockets really were. The neighborhood was buzzing now. Some residents were furious at Karen for dragging everyone into her circus. Others whispered that maybe she had a point, maybe the neighborhood really did need order. Division was her weapon now, and she wielded it like a blade. At one corner, Eleanor organized an impromptu block gathering, where she and I explained what had happened so far, showing proof of the fraud. At another, Karen held court in her driveway, painting herself as the victim of a smear campaign, waving the lawsuit packet like evidence of her own bravery. It felt less like a neighborhood dispute and more like a small-town election. By Friday, the tension broke into open conflict. I returned home to find red spray paint scrawled across my driveway, HOA Traitor. The letters dripped and spread in the sun, ugly and jagged. My cameras hadn't caught the culprit clearly, just a figure in a hoodie slinking away at dawn, but I didn't need crystal clarity. Who else would escalate to vandalism? Neighbors gathered, shaking their heads. Some offered to help scrub it off, others murmured about calling the sheriff again. I did both. The deputy arrived, sighed, took photos, and filed another report. "She's digging her own grave," he said. "Just hang tight." But I was tired of hanging tight. Karen was pushing harder, and I needed to push back. Saturday morning, I made my move. With Eleanor's help, I printed flyers. Real ones this time, not scams, and slid them into every mailbox. The truth about the HOA station, they read, with photos of the shed, the drone, the fake tickets, the condemnation sticker, even the lawsuit packet. At the bottom, I added a reminder that the sheriff and county had already declared the entire operation fraudulent. No exaggerations, no sarcasm, just the fact. By noon, people were clustered in driveways reading them aloud, passing them around like wildfire. Karen stormed down the street, ripping them out of mailboxes, screaming about defamation, but it was too late. The truth was spreading faster than her lies. That evening, she struck back. My power flickered, then went out entirely. The whole block was fine, just my house. I checked the breaker panel intact. Then I walked to the side yard and found the meter box tampered with, the lock snapped. Someone had cut my supply. I called the utility company immediately, who restored it within hours and filed a tampering report. Another black mark in my evidence folder. But as I sat in the dark waiting, I realized something important. Karen was no longer operating from a position of power. These weren't the acts of a leader. They were the acts of someone cornered, lashing out desperately to maintain control. Sunday morning confirmed it. I woke to find a "for sale" sign hammered into Eleanor's front yard, the word "foreclosure" spray-painted across it in red. Eleanor nearly fainted when she saw it. "I own this house outright," she cried, furious tears in her eyes. The cruelty of it snapped something in me. Enough was enough. I gathered the neighbors, one by one, and explained the plan. Monday morning, I'd be filing everything with the district attorney's office. Fraud, harassment, impersonation, vandalism, even attempted utility sabotage. But I wanted the neighborhood behind me, not just as witnesses, but as a united front. Slowly, people nodded, agreed. For the first time since this madness began, I felt the tide truly turning. That night, Karen must have sensed it too. I spotted her pacing her yard, phone pressed to her ear, voice carrying across the street. "They're all against me," she hissed. "But I'll make them pay. All of them." The hairs on the back of my neck rose. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was unraveling. And I knew the final confrontation was coming. I lay awake past midnight, listening for drones, for footsteps, for anything. The house was quiet, the cameras steady, the lights humming softly. But sleep never came. Because deep down, I knew tomorrow wasn't just another day. Tomorrow was when the storm finally hit. Monday morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of sky that makes you feel like everything is about to be exposed under the sun. I loaded my truck with the fat evidence folder, every photo and record tucked neatly inside, and headed toward the county courthouse. But before I even backed out of the driveway, a commotion down the street stopped me. Karen's yard was packed with folding chairs again, her driveway blocked by a rented podium with speakers blaring tinny patriotic music. She was staging one last stand, a desperate attempt to rally what remained of her supporters. As I stepped out of my truck, she grabbed the microphone, her voice booming through the neighborhood. "Citizens of Maplewood, we are under siege. Tyranny is upon us." She pointed at me, fingers shaking with fury. "This man wants to destroy our community. He wants chaos, weeds, and junk cars. But we will not bow. We will resist." A handful of neighbors clapped weakly, but most just looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seat. Some held my flyers in their hands, evidence of truth outweighing her theatrics. I walked calmly toward the podium, folder under my arm, my steps deliberate. The crowd hushed. Karen sneered. "Coming to gloat, traitor?" She spat into the mic. I stopped a few feet away and raised my voice without amplification. "No. I'm coming to finish this." I opened the folder and began laying evidence across her podium like cards in a poker game. The drone photo, the fake violation notices, the condemned sticker, the tampered meter box report, the vandalism photos. One by one, each piece stacked higher until it looked like a paper mountain in front of her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor stepped forward, brandishing her fake foreclosure sign like a weapon. "She put this in my yard," she shouted. Another neighbor held up a copy of a check made out to HOA Enforcement Authority. "She conned me out of $300, he yelled. Karen's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. "Lies. All lies," she screamed, slamming her hand on the podium. But the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. They'd seen too much, heard too much. The sheriff's deputy chose that exact moment to roll up, lights flashing. He stepped out, calm and steady, and walked straight to me. "Morning," he said. "I've been asked to collect your documentation for the DA's office." I handed over the folder without hesitation. He turned to Karen. "Ma'am, you need to come with me." The crowd erupted, some gasping, others cheering outright. Karen staggered back, clutching the microphone like a lifeline. "You can't arrest me. I'm the president of this community," she shrieked. The deputy shook his head. "No, ma'am. You're a suspect in fraud, impersonation, and harassment." He took her by the arm. She struggled, twisting and flailing, shouting about conspiracies, but the fight had gone out of her voice. The neighbors didn't rally to her side this time. They just watched. Some recorded on their phones. Others shook their heads sadly. As the deputy guided her toward the cruiser, Karen caught my eye. For a split second, I saw something raw and human, fear, maybe, or humiliation so deep it burned. Then she spat on the ground and hissed, "This isn't over." I didn't flinch. "It's over," I said softly. "You just don't know it yet." The cruiser door slammed, and with that, the spell was broken. The patriotic music still droned from the speakers, absurd and out of place, until someone unplugged the extension cord. Silence filled the street. Then, slowly, applause began, first from Eleanor, then from the family down the block, then from half the crowd until it swelled into something real. People clapped for the end of chaos, for the return of sanity, maybe even for me. But the story didn't stop there. Later that week, county workers dismantled the shed, hauling away the plywood and the spray-painted "station" sign. It felt symbolic, watching the pieces of Karen's empire carted off in a dumpster. Neighbors began chatting in driveways again, no longer whispering. Kids rode bikes without fear of tickets. Eleanor planted new flowers, defiant and bright. The block felt lighter, freer. Still, the scars remained. Some neighbors admitted they'd been too afraid to stand up earlier. Others confessed they'd actually believed Karen, at least for a while. Trust takes time to rebuild, and Karen had poisoned the well deeply. But in the quiet evenings that followed, when I sat on my porch with a beer watching the sun dip behind the trees, I felt something like peace return. Then came the final twist. A letter arrived from the district attorney's office, thanking me for my cooperation and detailing the charges filed. Fraud, harassment, criminal impersonation, property damage. The list stretched longer than I'd imagined. Karen would be facing real consequences now, not just neighborhood gossip. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the back of my folder, now less a shield and more a war trophy. One evening, Eleanor joined me on the porch, sipping sweet tea. "You know," she said, "you handled that better than anyone else could have. Calm. Patient. Never let her see you sweat." I smiled. Patience is the only thing people like Karen can't fight. She feeds on anger. You starve her when you stay calm. Eleanor chuckled. "Still, I wouldn't have minded seeing you lose your temper once or twice." I laughed with her. Tempting, I admitted. But in the end, the truth did all the shouting for me. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Kids chalked sidewalks. Neighbors swapped tools again. Barbecues sprouted in backyards without fear of unauthorized gatherings. But every so often, someone would glance toward the empty patch of dirt where the shed once stood and shake their head in disbelief. It was hard to imagine how close we'd come to letting one woman's fantasy of power rewrite the rules of our lives. As for me, I learned something valuable. Entitlement thrives when no one stands up to it. Karen had built her empire not with bricks, but with fear, and fear only works when people stay quiet. By shining a light, documenting, and waiting, I hadn't just protected myself. I'd helped protect all of us. Weeks later, a moving truck pulled up to Karen's house. Whether she was selling or fleeing the heat of her own mess, no one knew for sure. Neighbors watched from their porches as her furniture disappeared into the truck. Her car followed behind, and finally the house sat empty. Eleanor raised a glass in a quiet toast. "To peace," she said. I clinked my bottle against hers. "To peace," I agreed. And though part of me still expected another midnight photo, another drone buzzing over my yard, I also knew that for the first time in months, the war was truly over. The fake cops were gone. The shed was gone. And Karen, the queen of an empire built on nothing but clipboards and lies, was gone too. For the first time in a long time, Maplewood Drive was just a street again. And that was victory enough for me.